Our first speaker, Ed Bolen, has been the president and CEO of the NBAA since 2004. Prior to joining NBAA, Ed was the president of GAMA, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association. Ed's been a leading force and a strong voice in our industry for many years, and we appreciate that. We're also grateful that you found time, Ed, in your busy schedule. Ed was in St. Louis at an NBAA regional event yesterday, and the airlines did everything in their power to prevent Ed being here today. So thank you for sticking with it. When I got the phone call, Mercer, my boss, does not know this, but I got the phone call at what, 4 in the afternoon or something, that things were going awry. So I appreciate the fact that you stuck with it and made time for us in your schedule. So Ed, welcome to CBAS.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Alan. Good morning, everybody. It's exciting for me to be here and have an opportunity to talk with all of you. I got the call from Alan several weeks ago about the opportunity to come here and be part of it, and I was excited about that opportunity for a variety of reasons. Obviously, this is an important part of the country. A lot of different flight departments, FBOs, different types of operators, NBA members were going to be here. I've also heard a lot about Northern Kentucky University, so that was exciting for me to see this spectacular facility, particularly this building. But I also wanted to be here to take just a moment to thank and recognize a couple of people who I think have done some extraordinary stuff for our industry. Hal Shevers is here today, and it's been mentioned that he's going to provide some of the refreshments today. But you know, Hal has for decades been one of the leading people in our industry, and I don't think that that is often recognized and appreciated as much as it should be. I think when you look at what Sporty's has done in terms of generating new pilots, the professionalism, the service, and just what it means to our industry, Hal Shevers is someone who is really extraordinary. So I wanted to have an opportunity to publicly recognize and thank Hal. I also wanted to take a moment to particularly thank and recognize one of my great mentors and one of my great friends, one of the true giants in general aviation through the decades, and that's Phil Boyer, the former president of AOPA. I met Phil Boyer in the early 90s when I was a staff person for Nancy Kassebaum on Capitol Hill, and we were trying to pass the General Aviation Revitalization Act, and we couldn't really break our way through until Phil Boyer got into the saddle at AOPA and said, we're going to make this happen. And I'll tell you what, it felt like the cavalry had arrived. Shortly after that, we were able to pass the General Aviation Revitalization Act. Piper came out of bankruptcy. Cessna went back into production as single-pilot airplanes. Cirrus decided that they were going to certify their aircraft, and it brought forward a whole era of enthusiasm for the general aviation market. And then through the years, I think Phil Boyer really established AOPA as kind of a gold standard. He took a association that was losing membership, turned that around. He fought and helped us win several fights related to user fees. And I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank my great friend and mentor, Phil Boyer, for being here today. So thank you, Phil. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the industry, touch on just a couple of subjects that I know are on everybody's mind. But what I really wanted to do today is not to stand in front of a lecture hall and lecture at you. I'm hoping we can have a little bit of an interactive dialogue, an opportunity to kind of run some things to the ground. And there are a lot of things going on in our industry right now. I think the good news on it, as I've been going around and talking to people, particularly the last couple of weeks, I've been at NetJets last week. I spoke to the Kentucky Aviation Association last week. I was in Montreal with some large flight department heads. earlier this week at the forum yesterday. And I think kind of what I'm picking up is that while 2015 is not turning out to be a gangbuster record-setting year, as a general rule, it seems to me that most flight departments are flying more this year than they have before. It seems like flight hours are moving up a little bit. Fuel sales are moving up a little bit. Talking to the manufacturers, it seems a little bit of a mixed message. Some are doing a little bit better than others, but I think one of the encouraging things is it seems to be there's some kind of newfound strength this year, kind of in the level below the large cabin, ultra long range aircraft, which has really been dominating our industries since the downturn in 2008, 2009. So I think when you kind of put that together, if we get some renewed life in the smaller end of the market, if we see flight hours going up, that probably portends pretty well. So I think really what we're seeing is the industry right now is about as stable as it has been in the United States since the downturn. After the downturn, the future seemed like it was all outside the United States, all international markets. Everybody wanted to go to China or Brazil or Russia or India. And thankfully, those markets helped sustain the U.S. business aviation industry at a pretty dark time in our nation's economy. But it seems like now things are beginning to be a little bit more stable here in the U.S. And it's tough outside the U.S., but if you're only going to have one market that's performing well, better be the U.S., since that's at least 50% of the world's business aviation market. So feel relatively good talking to people about kind of the state of the industry. A lot of challenges, a lot of issues, but overall I think people are feeling better about 2015 than maybe some of the more recent years. A lot of big issues. As I said, I was up in Montreal. We're obviously going to be having a big issue discussed up there in 2016, which is emissions. I think a lot of people know that a couple of years ago, the European Union came forward with an emissions trading scheme that was particularly onerous. It treated aviation worse than any other industry. It treated business aviation worse than any other segment of the aviation industry. In other words, we were getting screwed. But we were able to get it kind of, I think they called it the stop the clock on implementation of the EU ETS. We now have that back up at the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal. That's going to be looked at this year. We are very concerned about it. It's easy for a lot of people to come together and find nonsensical, bureaucratic ways to try to get things done. But we're hopeful with the U.S. leadership that maybe we can find something that works. And so emissions is a big issue. Obviously, the other issue that I hear about everywhere I go are UAVs. Clearly something that 3 or 4 years ago would not come up if I were talking at a business aviation symposium anywhere in the United States. Today, it is always a front burner issue. What's interesting to me is I spent a little bit of time, as I said, talking to some large flight departments, and we almost immediately got onto the topic of UAVs. And what was interesting was how many companies that you think of as, in agriculture or in oil business or whatever it is, said, by the way, my company, I found out, is a heavy user of UAVs. And so it's kind of interesting. Suddenly they're using UAVs to look at oil rigs or different companies involved in agriculture. And how did you find out about it? Did it come through you? No, we have some technology people. And so the technology people are over here doing UAVs. The aviation people are over here doing aviation. And somewhere along the line, they both become aware of each other. It's a little amazing that we are seeing this. And one of the concerns about it is obviously there are kind of two completely different cultures that are coming together more by accident than by design. In the technology industry, the idea is, do something, get it out there, try it, fail fast, fail often, keep failing, keep trying. Well, The aviation industry, failure is not an option, right? So how do these two cultures come together? What are the rules? And I'm not sure we're ahead of the power curve on that. The FAA, as all of you know, has come out with some of their rules on UAVs, talking about trying to keep them below 500 feet, talking about keeping them, a couple miles from airports. But every day we're reading about new places where people who either don't know or don't care about aviation rules are getting into airspace and creating very serious safety issues. And so I think one of the things that is going on right now is we've got a new and emerging industry. I think the United States will probably play a leadership role in developing and operating UAVs, but right now it does not appear we've got a particularly comprehensive approach to how we're going to handle these aircraft. And I think they are truly presenting some very significant risk, and we're going to have to figure out how to address that. So a couple of new things, couple of new issues as I go around talking to people. The UAVs, emissions has been around for a while, but I think it's kind of reaching a critical point. And then we've got another issue that has been around for a long time, but it is very much front and center right now, and that is the issue of, are we going to privatize our nation's air traffic control system and fund it with user fees? Now, some of you who have been in this industry a long time, it probably feels a little bit like Groundhog Day. Here we go again. Privatize the FAA, fund it with user fees. Haven't we heard that before? The answer is we have. We heard about it in the 1990s. At that point, the real genesis behind privatizing the FAA and funding it with user fees was new and different competition from the low-cost carriers, namely Southwest Airlines, with the large entrenched legacy carriers. And at that time, the leaders of the legacy carriers wanted to come up with a new system that would help them use the government to compete with Southwest Airlines. Because back then, you remember, the commercial ticket tax was all based 100% on the price of the ticket. And the average legacy carrier's ticket was something like $300, and Southwest Airlines was flying everybody for $69. So on a percentage basis, it was much cheaper. So what the big airlines wanted to do is they wanted to come up with a user fee system that would treat all airplanes the same. So it was going to lower their average tax, raise Southwest tax, get rid of some of that really cheap flying, get them up over $100 with taxes, and boy, that would help them compete. Big fight with the airlines, kind of internecine warfare there. It ended up, they kind of changed the tax. They did a little bit on a per departure basis. Southwest had more departures than anybody else because they were short hops. The larger carriers ended up not getting what they wanted. They still kept some on percentage tax. So that kind of fought to a standstill in the 90s. Next time it came up was really the 2006-2007 timeframe. And at that point, the airline lobby, by now Southwest has grown up, part of the Air Transport Association, it's part of the airline lobby. It's beginning to operate a lot like the other airlines. They're starting to see that, well, they're just going to have to live together. Let's set our sights on somebody else. So in 2006 and 2007, the major airlines got together, came up with a proposal to privatize the air traffic control system and fund it with user fees. They called a press conference. They announced that this was their goal. That's part of the FAA reauthorization. They were going to get privatization done. They were going to get user fee done. And they were going to do it for 3 reasons. They wanted 3 outcomes from that effort. They said they wanted to gain, for the airlines, control of the air traffic control system. The airlines wanted to decide who can fly where and who can fly when. The second thing that they said they wanted to do is get Congress out of the way. Last thing they need is some congressman from some big box state telling them we need to care about flights to these small towns and rural communities. So give the airlines control to decide who can fly where and when. Get any of these elected officials out of there. And 3, they wanted to use the user fees to shift between $1.5 and $2 billion from their tax bill to business aviation. So that's what they wanted to do. And they came up with a entire ad campaign. They ended up spending over $25 million. And the idea is we want to take Aunt Edna, sitting in row 24, seat B, and we want her to pay less, and we want the fat cats in corporate aviation to pay more. That was their campaign. They said Aunt Edna likes to wear big wigs. She doesn't like to subsidize them. And we had a fight. And a lot of you were part of that fight. And it went on and on. They hit us, we hit them. We made the point that the big airlines were just looking for another bailout. They got their bailout. They got bankruptcies. They've gotten bailouts. They got all this money from the government. They still want more. And we had a pretty ugly fight. Ultimately, the FAA reauthorization bill that got passed did not privatize the air traffic control system and fund it with user fees. Effectively, our community stood up. We fought hard. We stuck together, thanks to Phil Boyer, who said this is not going to happen on my watch, and it didn't. We were able to get that done. The airlines were not happy about that. In fact, they took a couple of pretty direct actions after that happened. One, they changed the name of their association. They noticed that all of us in general aviation were talking about how we serve small towns and rural communities, how we were creating jobs, how we were spurring economic development, how we were doing some humanitarian flights. Basically, we were talking about why business aviation, general aviation, is good for America. So the Air Transport Association decided to change their name. They're now officially known as Airlines for America. A little kinder, softer, gentler. The other thing they did is they fired their CEO and brought in the top lobbyist in Washington, D.C., the guy who ran congressional affairs for the Bush White House. Both Bush White Houses, 41 and 43. So they changed their name. They changed their leadership. They're currently running a lot of ads that will tell you every day. They've got a current 6-month, $2 million ad campaign on why airlines are good for America. And it looks a lot like all of our talking points. So you get the feeling they've got the playbook and said, hey, that was a good idea, let's steal it. But that's what's going on. So the airlines are now coming back. We've got a new FAA reauthorization debate. And here are the airlines with their same old proposal. They're marketing it much differently than they did in the past. Remember, in 2006, 2007, they said, we, the Air Transport Association, are doing this so we can get control of the system, we can get Congress out of the way, and we can cut our taxes. And policymakers said no. This time, they're not saying any of that. They're still proposing the same thing, but they're saying, we're doing this to make America's air transportation system great. A lot of other places in the world privatize, use user fees. We want those efficiencies. We're doing this to keep America at the forefront of air transportation. And we're helping it because we think it will make next gen a reality. So they've got the same idea, they got the same product, but they got different packaging and a different marketing strategy. What used to be, we want control of the system and we want to cut our taxes, is now we want to make next gen a reality. Which is interesting because every time next gen comes up and you talk about how much are you, the airlines, willing to pay for it, they say we're willing to pay nothing, we get no benefits out of it. Nevertheless, they still want it to happen. All right, so where are we then? If we've been fighting this for all these years and we keep winning, why should we think there's anything new or anything different about this challenge that would make us need to do more and do better? Well, the primary thing that is different this time is that the air traffic controllers, which have always been our great allies in this fight, are suddenly suggesting, well, maybe a privatized system wouldn't be so bad for us. You see, what the controllers are concerned about, and all of you know, Congress is pretty dysfunctional. We have sequestration. We have government shutdowns. And they're concerned that being part of the government may not be as secure or lucrative as it used to be. And so they're basically saying, let's see what the deal is. Let's see who will pay us more. And there are some privatized systems around the world that pay their controllers pretty well. And so they're open. They're talking, openly. Well, we just want the best deal. So that is a pretty significant difference. We also have, as I said before, the airlines are just flat better than they were before. So here we are on the verge. We do know that a bill will be introduced in the near future. The FAA's authority to operate right now is scheduled to expire at the end of this month. We expect that there will be an extension of its authority for some period of time, perhaps 6 months. But sometime soon, we've got to get on with passing an FAA reauthorization bill. And we know that the head of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has said, he said June 15th at a meeting of the Aero Club of Washington, D.C., he planned to introduce a bill, and the hallmark of that bill would be a privatized air traffic control system funded by user fees. So we know what to expect. We know the airlines have been pushing it. We know that this is going to come forward. The question is, where is it going to go from there? Is this going to happen, or are we going to be able to find a better way forward? Now, there have been, since that announcement was made on June 15th, we have done a couple of different things. The NBAA did a call to action to its members. We went out to all of you and said, can you contact your members of Congress? Just go on our website, put in your name, put in your address, form will come up, hit send, and let your elected officials know how we as a community feel about this. We got the best turnout we have ever received within our community, thousands of letters going up to Capitol Hill. We know that the introduction of the bill was delayed. We know that some things have come out about the airlines over the last couple of months that haven't been all that pleasant and would make one question whether they're a group you want to turn the air traffic control system over to. And then just yesterday, an interesting poll came out where they asked people in the public, do you generally favor privatization of government services? And most Americans favor privatization of government services. Most Americans think anything the government can do, the private sector can do better. I'm probably one of those people that thinks that way. But they ask a second question is, do you want to privatize air traffic control? And in that answer, things changed. At that point, 55% of Americans said, no, we don't want to privatize our air traffic control system. Only 29% said they were for it. So by a 2-to-1 margin, people don't want to privatize their air traffic control system. And I don't either, and I don't think any of us should. A lot of people ask about, well, what would a privatized system look like? How would that function? And the answer is we don't know what it would look like in the United States. And this time around, we haven't seen the bill. But we do know is what privatization looks like at other parts of the world where it has been tried. It's been tried in Australia, for example. In Australia, commercial airplanes get priority over non-commercial airplanes. They turned it over to a board. A bunch of smart people got together and said, big airplanes should have priority over little airplanes. So there's no first come, first serve in Australia. In Australia, and I just had a member of my board of directors. They've got a big facility doing a lot of work in Australia. Took their whole board of directors to Australia to show them what was going on there. They then got on the company airplanes in Melbourne, taxied out, and they were told, you now have an indefinite hold. 5 hours later, their planes were able to take off. 5 hours. We don't need that in the United States. Canada, they did one of those things where they said, we're going to privatize, and at least for some segments of general aviation, we're going to eliminate your fuel taxes and you're going to go to a registration fee. Guess what ultimately happened? Kept the taxes and got the registration fee. And oh, by the way, in Canada, you see a bunch of the airports are privatized. So you got the privatized airports sending you the bills. You got the air traffic control sending you the bills. I had one of my members come and show me what their bills look like when they just went across some of Canadians' airspace on their way to Europe, and the stack was about that thick, complicated. And now the question is, are we really going to emulate some of those? We're worried about those policies. How do those policies happen? Can't a well-informed board do a nice job of making sure that doesn't happen? Maybe, but we haven't seen it. Everywhere we see these boards, we see they're dominated by the airlines. In the United States, every proposal we've ever seen about a board that looks like industry generally starts with somebody saying, well, gosh, let's get those smaller carriers, let's get the larger carriers, let's get the cargo carriers, let's get the airline pilots, let's get the airline flight attendants union. Let's give a seat to general aviation. And if they're particularly generous, they might give us 2. We're outvoted 5-2. Now, if taxes are being discussed, if access are being discussed, if the future of our industry is being discussed, being outvoted 5-2 doesn't feel all that good. So we've been concerned about it. Unlike the airlines who say we don't want anyone from Congress talking about their big box states and access to their small towns and rural communities, we think that's been a good deal for business aviation. Because a lot of business aviation, despite the myths and stereotypes, takes place in small towns and rural communities. You guys probably know some of the companies that operate out of places like Kohler, Wisconsin, or Pella, Iowa, or Red Wing, Minnesota. There's a lot of great American companies that are operating out of small towns and rural communities. And we want them to be able to have access to the New York market, Chicago, LA, some of these other things. We don't need to find out business aviation is going to take second seat. We'll just go whenever the airlines deem that we can have access to the air traffic control system. So this is a big fight. It's a big issue. It's not one that we can assume because we have fought and won in the past, we're going to win in the future. As I said before, the airlines took pretty drastic steps. It's not often you not only change the leadership of an association, you change the name of an association, you change the brand of an association. That's pretty big stuff. Oh, by the way, almost all of the airline CEOs that were there in 2006 and 2007 when they came up with the initial proposal are still there. Now, one of them just left in Chicago recently, but he's been at the forefront. He's been testifying before Congress. This is what they want to do. So don't be surprised that new packaging, new marketing doesn't really make the end product much different than it was to begin with. This is a plan that the airlines are pushing to give them control to say who can fly where and who can fly when in the United States. We think that they may just run the air traffic control system for their benefit and others' detriment. We think they may take their tax bill and give it to us. And we think that unless that board is different than any we've seen, we might just get outvoted 5-2. This is not a good way to go, particularly when the Inspector General just did the review at the request of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee and found out something that I think surprised a lot of people, maybe even the people that asked for the study, and that is the United States has the most efficient air transportation system in the world. It has the most complex air transportation system in the world, but it has the most efficient. It also has the safest, the largest, and the most diverse. If we've got the safest, largest, most complex, most diverse, and most efficient air transportation system in the world, do we really need to look at what other countries are doing to model it? So that's a big deal. The Inspector General said, we've got the best air transportation system in the world. We certainly know we've got the best business aviation market in the world here in the United States. Nowhere else do we see the kinds of big companies, small companies, operating all kinds of aircraft, all types of general aviation aircraft for a business purpose. We've got something pretty good here, but we're not going to keep it if we just sit back and say, that's Washington. I don't want to deal with Washington. Let's let them just do their thing. I'm doing my business. If we do that, the environment might change in ways we're not happy with. You know, they say in a democracy, you ultimately get the government you deserve. That means if you don't participate in it, we don't know what's going to happen. We've got to be participatory. So I want to, before I take questions, I want to take a moment to thank everybody here who has already contacted their elected officials on this issue. If you haven't, I want to implore you to do it. It will take less than 3 minutes on the NBAA webpage. Don't just do it yourself. Get your family to do it. Get your friends to do it. Get your colleagues to do it. It's not that hard. And I will tell you, having worked on Capitol Hill, it does matter. I had a lot of people say to me, it's just a form letter. What difference does that make? But you see, on Capitol Hill, things operate a little differently. Everybody talks about, well, you know, it's a democracy. People go vote. Your votes don't matter. We're probably not a majority anyway, so who cares? The reality is elections are not decided by majorities. Only a minority of Americans ever vote. So when a politician starts thinking about who are my constituents, who's going to vote for me, it's not everybody in their state. It's not everybody in their district. It's a minority of people that will actually go to the polls. So they've got to get a majority of the minority. Who are those people? Well, there's one thing they believe on Capitol Hill. People who care enough to write a letter, people who care enough to send an email, probably care enough to vote. So just because you have sent a letter, they've registered, hey, that's a voter. We better figure out what the voters are talking about. And every Monday on Capitol Hill, there are meetings where senators and congressmen ask their staff, hey, what are we getting mail on? What's hot? What are people talking about? The higher the numbers are, week in and week out, the more attention the elected officials pay. So getting ourselves in front of them, getting our message there, whether it's just through a form letter. Look, personal meetings are better than letters. Personal letters are better than form letters. But even form letters change here's a constituent who's taken time to do something. They're probably a voter. This is an issue we better get on the right side of. So please, take action, get active, get engaged. Let's make sure we can find a way to ensure that business aviation going forward has an opportunity to access airports, to access airspace, and to do it in ways that are safe and predictable and affordable. That's what we need. So let me close there and take some of your questions. Phil. Yeah. So Phil's question is, what happens to the amount of general taxpayer revenues that help fund the FAA? The FAA currently has something like a $15 or $16 billion a year budget. They get somewhere around $2 billion worth of general taxpayer revenues. The rest is generated by all the taxes we pay, the fuel taxes we pay, the commercial ticket taxes, the cargo way bill that FedEx and UPS pay. So we have this kind of contribution of about 13 or 14 billion from industry taxes, another $1 or $2 billion from general taxpayer revenues. Well, if you go to a privatized system, you immediately lose that general taxpayer revenue, right? So, okay, how do you fill up that gap? Either everybody's got to pay more, or you got to start eliminating services. Nobody's really talked about how that is going to happen, but I think it's fair to say we're probably not going to eliminate a lot of services very quickly. So at least in the near term, taxes are certainly going to go up for everybody, and that's not talked about often, but that can have an economic impact. I also want to, while you're talking about it, there's the price of the user fee. what does it get when I get the invoice? Is it going to say $25, $100, or $1,000? And that's a big deal. But what's not on the user fee is how much does it cost to process and pay that. And what we have heard from Delta Airlines when they were testifying in front of ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, they said they get user fees all over the world, and they've determined, depending on the user fee, that processing charge for Delta Airlines, the opening up the invoice, the reconciling it with their logs, the arbitrating of any disputes about appropriateness of charges, the creating a purchase order to pay it, the writing the check, the putting it in the mail, and the mailing it, Delta Airlines says it costs them between $85 and $125 to process an invoice. Now, here's what scares me. Delta's in that business. This is what they do. They have trained experts who are doing it. If their best efficiency gets it down to at best $85, what's that going to cost a shoe manufacturer trying to just build work boots in Red Wing, Minnesota? Probably a lot more. So you get the bill, and it tells you what you owe, and then you get the hidden administrative tax burden. It's a double whammy. And it doesn't create any more money for the system, doesn't get in any new air traffic equipment, doesn't modernize anything. It just costs. It's a bad way to go, particularly when we can pay with the fuel tax and we're done. It's a lot better way to go forward. Aaron? Well, so Aaron brings up a good question. Some of you remember when the FAA last had its authority expire, we went through a multi-year, multi-extension period before we ultimately got the FAA reauthorization bill passed. Question is, are we going to be back in a multi-year, multi-extension? And the answer is we don't know. We were told a year ago that we were not going to do any extensions. Either the community was going to come together and find a consensus, or we were, going to do something a little more targeted than the big, bold, transformative reform. The industry has not come together. But instead of just doing targeted solutions to identified problems, we're going to continue. How long that's going to continue, I don't know. You will still hear from the people on Capitol Hill that they want to get a bill done. The same people that are working on the FAA reauthorization bill are working on the highway bill. And the highway bill has expired sooner. It's a bigger pot of money. It affects more Americans on a daily basis, so they've all said, we're going to do the highway bill first, and then we'll do the FAA bill. It's not clear when they're going to address the highway bill, so it's not clear when they're going to do the FAA, how many times we're going to have extensions. But we do know at least one. We're not going to get the FAA bill done before September 30th. So there will be at least one extension. It will probably be 6 months. Whether or not they can use the time between September 30th and 6 months later to get a bill done, nobody knows. And it kind of depends on what's the community look like. Is it a divided community, or is there enough consensus that we can isolate a couple of smaller groups and jam it down their throat? Anybody else? Yeah. Right. So, clearly, well, it would affect the airlines. Yeah. So there is a lot of activity going on at ICAO. And I think everybody knows we're living in a world that talks a lot about environmental impact. And that talk about the environmental impact is leading to rules and regulations that can be both onerous and completely out of proportion with the levels. I think if you look at emissions, aviation is something like 2% of all man-made emissions. General aviation is like 2% of the 2%. You get down to really small numbers. But the solutions come back and they're huge. They're onerous. They're expensive. I think that the general feeling among the general public and policymakers is even though the numbers don't make sense, we have to see stuff going on. We need regulations. So nothing is probably not an option. Regulations that do the least harm, that end up not, one, being overly onerous to comply with, and two, being reasonably affordable, are probably the best outcome. How do we make that work? And that's what we're working with the airlines. They don't want any additional cost or administrative burden. They don't have to endure either. And I think there's a conversation going on there. How do we address the environmental issue and do it in a way that isn't punitive? In my perfect world, right. Correct. Well, you raise an outstanding point. And you're exactly right that we've got 535 members of the House and the Senate. We know their names, we know their addresses, and we get to have some vote in whether or not they can continue in their job. So we have the ability to reach them in a very real and immediate way. The international community, and ICAO is a UN organization. And so you're dealing with 200 countries meeting in Montreal that may or may not have any business aviation or general aviation in their country deciding our fate. That's a scary proposition. Now, we at NBAA have an opportunity to work with ICAO through an organization that we helped stand up several years ago called the International Business Aviation Council. They're headquartered in Montreal. They're embedded in the ICAO building. They go to all the meetings. They talk about our industry. I took my board of directors up to Montreal. We held a meeting with them in June. With IBAC, we presented to the group about what business aviation is, how it operates, the improvements that we have made, and the leadership we've taken in the environmental effort, whether it's introducing the world to winglets or flying GPS operations. We went up there, we met with them face to face, we talked to them, and the United States has an ambassador that sits up there. But yes, it is a lot more difficult to influence an international body, a global body, than it is our immediate federal government. It's easier to influence governments the closer they are to you in proximity and impact. And so this is a bigger challenge. And that's why, you have different friends and allies and enemies on every day. This is one where we are working closely with the airlines, trying to find some way forward in this that will make some sense and some ability to comply without being devastated. But this is a big challenge, and it's one we're taking seriously. As I mentioned, I was in Montreal last week. We had our board up there. I'm going up there several times. We're working hard with the U.S. ambassador. We're working hard with the International Business Aviation Council. But this is a big issue, and it It is decided every 3 years. Everybody comes to Montreal and they meet. They call it the triennial. They're going to be meeting in 2016, and on the docket is emissions. So we're going to be spending even more time up there over the next several months as we get ready for the February meetings and the October report outs. This is a big issue. Yes. You're exactly right. Paper cuts, nickel, dime, whatever you want to call it, it's very real. And all of it at the end of the day makes you say, is it really worth it or not? And that's why you can't just take a pass and say it's no big deal. You can't even look at the amounts and say it's a nickel and a dime. You got to put it all together, and that's what we're facing. Al, you bringing out the hook? Well, listen, let me just close back where I started. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you here today for the Cincinnati Business Aviation Symposium. I appreciate the fact that so many of you are part of NBAA. Appreciate everything that all of you do to make our air transportation system work in the United States, to keep us the world leader in every aspect of aviation. So have a great day, and thank you for letting me join you today.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it very much. I'm thoroughly involved in NBAA. I'm privileged to be able to have that opportunity through Reynolds Jet. I'm also privileged to be part of some of the things that NBAA takes care of for its members and the industry as a whole. Several of us here are involved with the Domestic Operations Committee and some other bits and pieces, and work with the FAA and some work groups. So if you are not a member of NBAA and you have a desire to make a difference and make a change, that is certainly one group that does a fantastic job.